welcome students to the online NPTEL course Contemporary Architecture and Design. In the previous class we started discussing about the modern art movement. So we will conclude with the modern art movement which were left and yet to be discussed. So one of the art movement of modernist era was Cubism, and among the few of the famous Cubist painter, Pablo Picasso was one of them. And in the Cubist movement, this quite similar to the previous art movements where we have seen Impressionism, Expressionism and Pointillism, they started deviating from the figurative approach of depicting a painting. So they started going towards the abstraction again, and because of the invention of the camera, which can depict, which can capture a figurative and the realistic environment in a much better way, and much because it is just a machine, and which that's why the artists and painters wanted to deviate from that, and they invented a different style of depicting their expression. So in Cubism, what is the style is it was broken into different geometric form, which is mostly cubist or the rectilinear form, and the paintings were broken into like that. So in Picasso's painting we can see that the human figures and the animal figures were broken in different lines, and mostly rectilinear lines. And one of the thought is Cubist is sometimes it's like has a fourth dimension into the painting. So it's not just two different dimensions, so it captures the movement. So one of the painting by Pablo Picasso is Las Meninas, which was painted during the Baroque period by Velázquez. So the same painting of Velázquez was reinterpreted into Pablo Picasso's style, and there the princess was shown like the different faces were there, and then the human bodies were in different direction. So here in the one of the Picasso's painting, we can see the faces were turned and twisted, and there's a series of there are different eyes they can they were in a different angle, so which was there in the Futurism movement of Russia as well. So this is another painting by Brock, in which this is a violin and candlestick was painted, and all the different surfaces of violins were shown from different angles, so that it has a experience of a time dimension. It's not just one angle of the painting, it's different angles were juxtaposed, and this becomes like a broken facade of all the surfaces, which is like an experience over the time. So this is a Russian Futurism. So this is the cyclist painting by Natalia Goncharova, which we'll also discuss, because later in the postmodern architecture, many of the postmodern architects took inspiration from this Cubist and Russian Futurist, as well as the suprematist movement. So this here you can see in the cycle, there are not just one ring of the cycle, there are a series of lines of cycles, series of legs. So this is one human figure, but there's 2-3 legs we can see. So this depicts the motion, which is the fourth dimension, which is time, which is captured in the 2D painting. So this is another way of depicting different dimensions in 2D, which camera cannot do in general way. If you change the shutter, play with the shutter speed, or change the exposure, and you superimpose 2-3 click, that then it might happen, but generally it cannot be done in the camera. But the way also they are changing the expression, which cannot be done in the camera. That's why it's not this is going away from the figurative depiction. So we have also seen in architecture they were going away from the figurative depiction, and architecture also becomes abstract, and this abstraction from figurative to abstraction is a journey in the modernism. So gradually they started going towards the abstract in architecture as well. This happened. So another movement is suprematism. So this is quite similar to, if you just look at it, it might look like a Bauhaus or this style or this digital movement. But in this style movement, it was the concept was different. That was a superimposition of the rectilinear lines and pure shapes, and three different colors were used, which was the primary colors with black and white. And the overall composition of this style or this digital movement and Bauhaus was very functional and very rectilinear in nature. If we look at the Piet Mondrian's painting, so this was quite different. And suprematism, the pioneer of suprematism was Kazimir Malevich. So here it is in a different angle. Sometimes you will see there is no correlation between the angles, which was not there in the Bauhaus and this style or the digital movement. So this was twisted in a different direction, and different colors were used. And if you look at, so there's no particular angle between these two, and which was there in a few of the Kandinsky's work, which Kandinsky was explored with a different style. But the Kazimir Malevich's thought process came from a different perspective. So you can read more about the suprematism, and the later phases of Kazimir Malevich's work was he was exploring with black and white, which also goes with the visually it might look similar to Bauhaus or this style movement, but it's from the conceptual level it's quite different. And many of the cases he started painting white on white. So this we are seeing black on white background. Sometimes he has many geometric objects on top of the same color. So this will be a white of a different value level, and this will be another white patch of square or circle in different value levels. So he was exploring the different value in different value change, how people psychologically perceive the shape. And here in suprematism, it's mostly like juxtaposition of different shapes, and there are different curvilinear and organic shapes as well in the suprematism. So here this is mostly a 2D expression in suprematism. It's painting. It did not go into the sculpture, but one of the architect and painter Lazare Khidekel changed the transferred the suprematism into 3D and architecture. These are all conceptual. So this was not built, but he explored suprematism in 3D. So this is a 3D expression of suprematism where different rectilinear cuboids were juxtaposed and created a beautiful composition out of it. So later there are also Russian Futurism and Russian Constructivism in architecture, so which will be discussed while we discuss the postmodern, one of the postmodern movement, which is Deconstructivism, and we will see what is the difference between Constructivism and Deconstructivism. Constructivism was one of the movement in modern era, which was mostly conceptual, and it was not built, like Tatlin Tower and other very complicated structures they have made, which was not during modernist movement. The construction technique was not known, and it was the construction technique was not as advanced as the design, the conceptual design was, and so these kind of structures which they made was not was just was on a conceptual level. So this was constructivism. Later in the in the postmodern, the later phases of postmodern, deconstructivism was one of the movement which took inspiration from constructivism as well as suprematism and the Russian Futurism as well as the Cubism. So how they have taken inspiration in details we discuss when we discuss the deconstructive architecture. But here we can see what are the different art movements were there. Constructivism was not an art movement; it is an architectural movement which happened in modernist era, but this was not, it cannot be called as a complete movement. It just was was in a conceptual level, and it did not flourish much. So we're not discussing that. We'll just discuss this part of Russian constructivism when we discuss deconstructive era phase, which is part of the postmodernism. So we can see lot of modernist art and conceptual architectural designs got translated into the postmodern era. So gradually, mostly when we discuss postmodernism, few of the modernist movement, architectural movement got translated, like metabolism and brutalism. We saw that got translated into the postmodern era as well, and the later phases like tensile and shell was translated into different postmodern era, like metabolist. This modularity was extensively used today's today's era as well, and then the sculptural quality of tensile and shell structures were also used in today's in the postmodern era, and it got translated. And there's also neo modern architecture, which was a revival and reinterpretation of modern architecture, mostly which is industrial internationalism. But there are a lot of art movement from there. Postmodern postmodern architect took inspiration from. So this is one of the painting by M.C. Escher. So he talked about the duality, and this is the painting is called Infinity. So here, if you look at the painting carefully, so this plan and elevation and the different facades of different dimensions, x, y, and z dimensions are getting twisted. So it's getting an so the name of the painting is Unity. So there's a unity and cohesion and continuum between the x, y, and z axis. So the staircase is can be seen from this side and also can be seen from this side, and then there's a lot of dilemma was used and in this etching and by Michael Escher. So here we can see, so this kind of duality and the question of dimensions was created. And now one of the postmodern architect, Peter Eisenman, used this concept in his one of the house. This is wall house 6. So he have designed many houses, and he numbered it from 1 to gradually he started numbering. So this is the house number 6, which will be discussed in the postmodern style. So this is a postmodern building where this is not a minimalist style, and where aesthetics is becoming quite heavy and important. So here he used this Escher's stair in a real life. So this is a real stair which is green, and here also you can see a lot of lines are coming, which is like cardboard, and so this is inspired from a cardboard architecture, and all these lines are coming together. So this is a column line and beam lines are not matching, and then this wall line is in somewhere in some other places, and there's hanging there's a slit on between the floors. So we'll discuss about this house, but the main thing is he got inspiration from Escher's this painting, and so this is a real staircase. And if you look at this staircase, this is just a inverted staircase, which is just a visual depiction of Escher's, which has got inspired from Escher's painting. So this red staircase is not usable. This is just a illusion of staircase, which if you turn on the other side upside down, then you can use it. So there's a human being like this, so he can climb from this staircase, which is not possible. So it is this is just a visual depiction, which is the criteria of postmodern architecture. So visual emphasis and sculptural qualities are becoming in few of the postmodern movement become quite important. So here this is the Peter Eisenman is taking inspiration from Escher. So Peter Eisenman, many of the architecture styles are coming on the deconstructive architecture style, and here he changes creates floors from outside, which looks like it's tilted, and also he have played with the construction techniques and the duality. So a few of the columns sometimes hang like that, which looks like a column, but it's not, because it does not touch the floor. So we will discuss that when we discuss Peter Eisenman's work. And another famous deconstructive architect is Zaha Hadid, and she gave a few talks where she talked about her architecture style got inspired from Kazimir Malevich's Suprematism, and the Suprematism is also closely linked with Cubist movement and other movements which was there. So there are a lot of there are few Cubist painting by Le Corbusier, where there's a violin, and many other different paintings of Le Corbusier, and so those paintings and the Russian Futurism and the Constructivism lead to a movement which is deconstructivism in later phases. So Zaha Hadid took inspiration from Suprematism, and she has a lot of talks, so you can go through those online talks in YouTube and other medias. So this is the Kazimir Malevich's work. This is the interpretation in the architecture which has been done. And then this is the sketch, the conceptual sketch by Zaha Hadid. If we look at in this slide of Suprematism, this is Kazimir Malevich's work. This is Lazar Khidekel's work, which is the translation of 2D to 3D, which has been done during the Suprematism era as well by Khidekel. And then she is translating this in the postmodern style, which is deconstructivism. And this is Zaha Hadid's conceptual sketch of a urban design or planning levels sketch. This is series of buildings, so this is not just a one building thing. So this is an abstract depiction of lines, and here we can see this was more of a direction, like one kind of visual style was there, which is cuboid, but the cuboids were positioned in different directions. So this makes the composition very heavy in visual. So a lot of elements are there. So this is not a minimalist composition, but from here she is making it more exaggerated with the curvilinear lines, which is the key characteristics of Zaha Hadid's architecture style. So she uses a lot of curvilinear flowy lines, which also comes from the mathematical parametric architecture, but here it is she got inspired from the Suprematism. And so with the curvilinear lines and the rectilinear patches and the juxtaposition of all these elements, she is creating this paintings, which later paintings or 3D digital models, which later got translated into the different. It can be in urban scale, urban design scale. It can be in the planning level scale, or it can also be in a very product design scale. And later she translates this kind of lines into the design. And in the next class onwards, we'll start discussing about the postmodern movement. So we'll talk about the holistically what is the criteria, what is the features of postmodernism, and after that we'll start and what is the difference between modernist movement and the postmodern movement in architecture as well as in the design. And then we'll start discussing of the postmodern architecture, and a few postmodern design and art movement will also be discussed. Thank you.